All right, joining us now, we've got NBC News White House correspondent Vaughn Hilliard, CNBC global supply chain reporter Lori Ann LaRocco, Senior Vice President and Director of Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations Shannon O'Neill, and New York Times White House correspondent Tyler Page. He's also the author of the book 2024, How Trump Retook the White House and the Democrats Lost America, which is out July 8th. All right, Vaughn, I want to start with you. Have we had any reaction from the White House to the reaction from China and this new 125% tariff?
Caroline Levitt was asked just a few moments ago specifically whether President Trump would pick up the phone call to call Xi Jinping and begin these negotiations or begin a stand-down effort on the tit-for-tat tariffs. And while she skirted that direct question, there is no apparent conversations or dialogue happening between China and the U.S. at this time. But she said that she was optimistic that China would understand that they need the U.S. economy and they need to maintain their relations with America, and that ultimately that they would come and find a way to strike a deal. Of course, during Trump's first administration, negotiations for a phase one deal took almost 2 years. And the question here is, with tariffs now at 145% on Chinese goods coming into the United States and now 125% tariffs on U.S. goods going into China, you're talking about sky-high tariffs, which Chinese officials suggested overnight amounts to a near standstill of trading relations between the two nations, that these tariffs could not stand to go any higher, yet they have maintained that they are not going to back down. And so the question here is, will the United States begin to initiate that dialogue with China, or are we looking at a prolonged back and forth at a time that clearly the markets have suggested that simply 90-day pause for the other countries' trading partners, that the China trade war is still of top concern here for investors at home?
And you heard the president in that long cabinet meeting yesterday say he wants to make a deal with China. He thinks he can make a deal with China. This does not seem to be going in the deal direction. Lorianne, I want to ask you about this phrase from that statement out of Beijing that U.S. goods would be no longer commercially viable. What does that mean, and how big a deal is that?
It's a huge deal. I mean, as you know, with the first trade war, agriculture has always been the crosshairs. But China showed the world that they didn't need U.S. soybeans. They actually started farming soybeans in Russia. In addition to this, in addition to the soybeans and other agriculture, you're looking at pharmaceuticals, electronics, oil, gas, and coal. And those are going to be slapped with a 125% tariff. And that effectively means that we're out of business there.
And Shannon, on that note, President Xi issued kind of a warning today in lieu of a direct phone call leader to leader with President Trump, saying, quote, there are no winners in a trade war, and going against the world will only lead to self-isolation. On Friday, according to CCTV's China state broadcaster, that's where this came out. He also said for over 70 years, China's development has relied on self-reliance and hard work, never on handouts from others, and it is not afraid of any unjust suppression. That kind of seems to me like she's saying if it's a battle of whose population is going to be willing to endure economic hardship, come at us. What does that statement say to you, Shannon?
Yeah, those are fighting words, I would say, right? This isn't making of a deal. And what I would say is since the last set of Trump tariffs that began in 2018, that then became Biden tariffs, that we have seen China systematically try to change and diversify its trading partners. So we have seen a big shift. So they trade more today with Southeast Asia than they do with the United States. They trade more with lots of other emerging markets than they do with the United States and Europe. So we have seen them begin to move away from the U.S. And while this will hit China hard, right? They send $460 billion worth of goods to the United States each year, which will fall down dramatically. They have been moving to other markets, and as they've moved into other markets and expanded their presence there, they've also expanded their presence in global trade. So they are making moves already to de-link themselves from the United States, and this will be really a break.
And Tyler, what policy options are left for the Trump administration if they want to keep this going? China has said, we're not going any further on this. I've seen conversations that maybe the U.S. could kick China off of the international banking system. Is that realistic? Where do you think it goes from here?
I think it's hard to predict exactly what Donald Trump will do next. As we've seen over the past several weeks, he's said a lot about what he wanted to do on tariffs, and we've seen what he's actually done change quite a bit over the course of the implementation process here. But it is clear that the undergirding, the idea that is undergirding this trade war is to try to isolate China. One of the ways that his advisors, as my colleagues and I reported in the New York Times, got him to back down from these reciprocal tariffs was to make this more about isolating China from the rest of the world. And one of the things I've heard from sources is that the Trump administration was growing increasingly concerned that Japan and South Korea were looking at becoming more aligned with China as it related to responding to these tariffs. That was a cause for concern within the Trump administration. So we know that the president is very focused on trying to win this quote unquote trade war with China as it stands right now. What other options he may take? Clearly, there are a lot of things in the toolkit for the U.S. to deploy, but it's hard to predict exactly what direction this will go. And I think it's also important to remember that what impacts this has on the rest of the market and the global economy will be key here. Obviously, one of the things about China is they have a lot of investments in the U.S. Treasury bond. That is something that we saw spooked the president and his economic advisors as we saw that sharp sell-off earlier in the week. So it's another thing to keep an eye on is how these tariffs and the escalation impact the broader economic market.
And Vaughn, President Trump did appear to feel pressure from Wall Street ahead of the 90-day pause. You heard Tyler just talk about kind of the international aspect of that. There was that rather unprecedented meeting between economic ministers from China and Japan and South Korea. But is there any amount of voter pressure he may feel on this specific issue that could change his mind about tariffs on China?
Right. We have seen in initial polling that when it comes to his handling of the economy, we have seen a majority of Americans disapprove of his agenda. At the same time, I mean, in so many ways, this echoes what he endured through his first administration. And there was much scrutiny. Some of his most loyal supporters, particularly in the agricultural industry, were the ones that were on the front lines of bearing the brunt of the financial losses caused by the trade war with China. And yet, the administration backfilled a great amount of their losses with ultimately $28 billion in financial relief payments to farmers across the country. And I think that is where you continue to hear from Americans on the ground. There is a desire and a hope that they believe in the long run that he will ultimately be able to put some trade deals together and that the U.S. will benefit from these efforts. So right now, there is no consequence that we see, and at the same time, that doesn't mean that there's not consternation about some of those financial losses mounting again and an increase in consumer goods. So for the president right now, he believes of the decade that he's been in power, that he is able to make a pitch to the American public that these battles are worth waging and that dominance over China is a fight worth having. And it's going to be seen over the course of these months ahead, if in fact he holds his ground, whether the American public at large sticks by his side.
But Tyler, when it comes to messaging, has the president left himself any room to maneuver when it comes to the China issue? You've highlighted the change around the narratives before the 90-day pause from the initial claim that, this was always the plan, as we heard from Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, to Trump directly referencing market volatility just a day later and even saying, he saw Jamie Dimon talking about this on TV. But it's more complicated with China because if China doesn't back down, do you think the president and the White House can figure out a way to make a deal that the U.S. would have to start capitulating on, or is that just off the table for this president?
I mean, one of the things that we've come to know about Donald Trump is that he's always trying to look for a deal and is able to spin it in the favor that he wants to. And he will find a willing audience in the Republican Party in Washington and throughout the country, often willing to fall in line and support whatever sort of messaging tactic he decides to do. We saw that with some of the Republican critics of his trade policy so far, very quickly falling in line and saying that it was brilliant maneuvering and, quoting from his book, The Art of the Deal, after he backed off some of the reciprocal tariffs. So I think the messaging is less of the concern for the president than it is the implementation and the impacts on Americans across the country. We're already seeing some members of Congress grow concerned about the impacts this economic situation could have as we move closer to the 2026 midterms. I know we just finished the November elections, but already those are underway with primary fights and eventually a contested race for the House and for some of these tight Senate races. So I think it's really going to be, as Vaughn was saying, as the months go by and this trade war really starts to hit Americans' bottom line, that's where we might see the president start to feel some real pressure. But so far, he has had a greater appetite for risk when it comes to markets than I think a lot of even some of his supporters anticipated.
Tyler, it is a Friday at the end of a very long week. I am not ready to hear the word election right now. It's okay. Shannon, but I want to talk to you about the flip side of this, because the impact on China, despite Xi saying, he's not afraid, a full-blown trade war with the U.S. means being shut out of the world's biggest consumer market. The Chinese economy is tailored to sell cheap goods to China. So is it possible that with enough prolonged pressure, we actually see China blink and come to the negotiating table?
Definitely going to hit the Chinese economy. And already they were having serious domestic problems in the real estate markets with their own domestic consumption. And we've seen over the last year a huge surge of exports out to the world precisely to revive the Chinese economy or give it sort of a boost. So this cuts out one of its biggest markets. But as I said before, China has started to move away from the United States as its main source or location for where it sends its goods. It started to focus on other markets. And I do think we will see it double down on that, looking at all kinds of markets around the world, whether that's the European Union, whether that's Asia, Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, other places. They will double down on those efforts. Now, they won't be able to make up for the U.S. market, assuming these tariffs stay there. It will be a big hit to China. But we also there have a political system that is all aligned behind Xi. So he does have the flexibility and the ability to handle the political pain. He, unlike the Republicans, will not face elections most likely in 2026.
The end of a volatile and dramatic week for the markets, for the global economy, for Main Street, for American households, for the whole country, the whole world, all because of one man, Donald Trump. The Dow today rising more than 600 points. It's after the White House said it was optimistic about a trade deal, and despite China raising its tariffs on American goods to 125%. There are other deeply ominous signs for the economy. A measure of consumer sentiment dropped to the lowest level in nearly 3 years, the second lowest level in the history of this survey being taken. And there's this, too, from CNBC, quote, respondents' expectation for inflation a year from now leaped to 6.7%, the highest level since November 1981, and up from 5% in March. So what that means is that the American consumer is now expecting inflation to go up, to be higher. And that sentiment comes 6 months after an election almost completely defined in the minds of swing voters by voter anger over the cost of living, the cost of stuff. CNBC adding this, quote, the survey showed unemployment fears rising to their highest since 2009. An economist tells CNBC, quote, consumers have spiraled from anxious to petrified. In the midst of this increasingly dire economic picture, you might think that business leaders would now feel comfortable about sounding the alarms. And make no mistake, they are alarmed. Headlines about a slowdown and warnings about the economy are everywhere you look. But brand new reporting suggests that they are now pulling their punches on what the cause of all of this uncertainty really is. Because, as we said at the top, the cause is one man and one man only, Donald Trump. New York Times reports this, quote, Wall Street's biggest firms on Friday attempted the tricky two-step of revealing the toll of President Trump's whiplash tariff policy without outright criticizing a man who has repeatedly tangled with the financial industry for slights both real and imagined. It is becoming clear that if financial titans have flashed some anger around Trump's tariff policy, they are wary of criticizing the president directly. One reason is that Trump has shown he's willing to confront bankers publicly. Shortly after his inauguration, in a speech given remotely to executives gathered in Davos, Switzerland, Trump complained to Bank of America's chief executive, Brian Moynihan, that the lender's conservative customers were having their bank accounts closed. Bank of America denies that. The First Lady Melania Trump has also claimed without evidence that their son Barron was denied an account at an unnamed bank. Some people on Wall Street are making it clear that they are holding back, and the threat of retribution from Donald Trump is why. Bloomberg reporting this about a call with a top JP Morgan analyst, quote, after calling the president's plan a, quote, sledgehammer, brute force approach, the analyst said he withheld certain material with his firm and colleagues in mind. Quote, this is the first time I've ever had to do a call where I had to think about the things that I was saying, not just in terms of how they reflect our views on markets and economics, he said, adding that he had never before taken such considerations into account in a career spanning more than 30 years. Quote, people are being held accountable for their views and the things they say in ways that they probably shouldn't be. So I've said most of what I wanted to say on this call, but not all of it. The business community, intimidated by Donald Trump and his threats of retaliation and retribution in the midst of a crisis created by Donald Trump, is where we start today. With me at the table, my friend and colleague Steph Rule, co-host of the 11th Hour here on MSNBC, as well as NBC's senior business analyst. Also joining us, former Deputy National Security Advisor to President Obama, MSNBC contributor Ben Rhodes. And Gillian Tett is here, columnist and member of the editorial board at the Financial Times. Steph, I've been glued to and riveted by all of your reporting and analysis and your personal views on where we've sort of careened. And this reporting is something I think you mentioned on the show a few days ago.
That reporting right there about the JP Morgan analyst, I think that tells the entire story. Because what we are experiencing is a crisis of confidence. Okay? The underlying economy is good, right? We had a good unemployment number. We had a good inflation number. But look what's happened. One of the reasons America is considered the greatest country in the world. We talk about American exceptionalism. The reason other countries want to do business here is because we have the rule of law. We have a government with three separate but equal branches that keep one another in check. We invest in science in this country. We have the greatest universities. Now imagine the rest of the world watching this. They're watching business leaders who are not shy. They love speaking publicly. It was 2 years ago, Jeff Bezos was out there saying he didn't like Joe Biden's policies, or he didn't like what he was doing around inflation, didn't like how he wanted to tax corporations. Now they're practically silent, or they're doing these extraordinary high wire acts, right? On Tuesday, the morning of the pause, Jamie Dimon said on Fox News, and it was no mistake that he went on Fox News to speak that to that audience, he said a recession is coming, or maybe it's here. And today they had their earnings report, and on that call he said, he didn't say the R word, but he said these are really troubled times ahead. But the fact that they're unwilling to say these things, the fact that that JP Morgan analyst who gets paid to analyze risks was unable to assess those risks and tell their clients. As soon as I read that report, I remembered 6 years ago, I interviewed Steve Schwartzman, the head of Blackstone, and in Davos. And I remember distinctly him telling me we would never invest in Russia. Not that there's not opportunities there, but it's because they can't trust the rule of law. And that is exactly what we're on the precipice of here. Because yes, stocks are way down because what's the impact of these tariffs are going to be? But the reason you are seeing treasuries get hit, the bond market getting hit, is because the rest of the world is saying, I'm not sure if I'm going to put my money in the safest place in the world, the USA, where in U.S. treasuries, because maybe it's not so safe. That is what is the most alarming.
So I have tried to take myself to school in the last few weeks, and one of the things that has been explained to me a few different times that I'm starting to understand is that the bond market is one of the best ways to understand the instability and to sort of parse out all of the doublespeak maybe that leaders are saying that the bond market doesn't lie. Will you explain that to me?
The bond market is the daddy, okay? Because that is where the whole world, that is where they park their money in the safest place.
In a crisis.
Right? In a crisis. So when the stock market goes down, right, the stock market is a riskier asset. Where do you put your money? In the safest place. In U.S. treasuries. So in any normal crisis, stocks go down, everybody parks their money in treasuries.
Like COVID.
Correct. But when suddenly both go down, that's when that is what spells disaster. Okay? Because suddenly when bond yields are up, it becomes way more expensive for us to refinance our debt, which is what we have to do. If suddenly China, who's the second largest holder of treasuries, if they're flipping us off saying, you know what? I'm sorry, if we're in the middle of a trade war, we're out. That could actually spell disaster. And the reason that is so jarring for markets is because every other time we've had a crisis, you can't even figure out the risks under the underlying economy is a disaster. This is completely self-made. It's why the market this week has been like up and down, because Investors are hoping and begging and praying that Trump just scratches this thing. Because if he does, we actually have a good economy. But if he doesn't, he has us on a collision course for disaster.
And how do you put the genie back in the bottle when he's now proven himself to be so herky-jerky? It was Trump who came out and said, I changed my mind, and the markets got yippy while his own officials were testifying. Never switching, never switching. This is the policy.
See, but that right there goes to the crisis of confidence. Who do you believe? Right? His own Treasury Secretary. When Donald Trump announced the pause, his own Treasury Secretary said, this was always the plan. Really? Was it the plan? Because Trump just said, I was looking at the bond market. I listened to Jamie Dimon. They're telling you different things. And we're watching Wall Street that wants to be optimistic, tie themselves in knots over this idea that Scott Bessent is going to be our savior. And let's be clear, Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, is a super smart guy. All of these markets we're talking about, he understands them. It's why he's worth what he is. But the fact that he's going on television and not being intellectually honest, nor is Howard Lutnick, that's what's so disarming, because people are saying, oh, great, Scott Bessent is going to be the one negotiating these deals. The negotiations, Nicole, are not rooted in truth, because Donald Trump's understanding of trade deficits aren't reality, right? These countries are begging, they're kissing my ass, they're begging for a deal. Donald Trump's plan is we have to wipe out trade deficits because he doesn't understand trade deficits. You think Vietnam is going to start importing more than we do? It doesn't work that way. I'm not saying there are some unfair trade practices. If only we could get together with our allies and take on China, kind of like the Trans-Pacific Partnership that they wanted to do at the end of Obama's second term. But instead, we're going at it alone. And Donald Trump, unfortunately, at this point, has overplayed his hand. Investors are just hoping that a Bessent saves the day, or maybe Trump lays the blame on a few other guys in the White House and punts them and brings other guys in. But this is wish casting. And if you're in the business community, big or small, I mean, Nicole, you think something's going to get solved in 90 days? USMCA, the last trade deal done with Canada and Mexico, took 18 months to complete. You really think just because they keep saying to us, 75 countries are calling us, what deals are they going to get done? And this is why people are somewhat paralyzed. And it's funny because they want to buy stocks, right? They're looking at companies they like Apple. I want to buy this, I want to buy that. And they're going, but I don't know what's in store. If suddenly AirPods are about to cost 39% more, right? If Amazon is saying, well, maybe all of our Chinese sellers are going to be off the platform. And so for those Trump supporters who say, I'm grateful for what the president is doing, he's doing the hard work, just wait. Because everything in our life is about to get more expensive. If you ran a small business, you better bet your bottom dollar there's a decent chance one of your suppliers is China. So walk into a shopping mall tomorrow and take a close look at your favorite stores, because there's a good chance if these tariffs are in place, even if they're only 10% with most of these countries, stuff's about to cost more. At the exact same moment, when look at the Treasury market, borrowing costs are going to go up. So if you put things on your credit card, well, that's going to cost more.
I couldn't be more honored to tell the American people that we're bringing back their dollars and we're saving them and returning them to the United States Treasury.
So I think we're doing a lot of good and an excellent collaboration with the cabinet to achieve these savings.
This country has gotten bloated and fat and disgusting.
That's a little bit descriptive. These guys have promised us that the reason they are gutting the government is to save you money, save all of us money. But here's the thing. When you take a step back and look at what they're actually doing, you begin to realize they're not doing a very good job of saving us money. A Wall Street Journal analysis of daily financial statements issued by the Treasury Department found that government spending since the inauguration in January of this year is $154 billion more than in the same period in 2024 during the Biden administration. Let me break it down. That means Donald Trump has spent $154 billion more than Joe Biden did at this time a year ago. The analysis essentially shows that Elon Musk's slash and burn philosophy isn't saving the American taxpayer money at all, which explains why he lowered his projected savings dramatically yesterday during a cabinet meeting. Meanwhile, Trump is set to land in West Palm Beach tonight, which is part of his weekly weekend vacation exodus. Since January, he has spent 10 out of the 11 weeks at one of his properties. According to one estimate published in 2019 by the Government Accountability Office, each trip to Mar-a-Lago, and this is in 2019 dollars, cost the American taxpayer roughly $3.3 million. Joining me now is Congresswoman Stacey Plaskett, delegate to the House of Representatives from the U.S. Virgin Islands. Madam Congresswoman, it's great to have you at the table.
Good to be here with you.
There's a whole lot of cost savings going on right now.
Well, not really.
But how come we don't seem to see it? Where is it?
It's not really for you. They're not really saving money, right? The American Enterprise Institute did a study. Elon Musk says he has saved $140 billion with his cost savings. And the AEI, which is a conservative group, says that, no, actually, in fact, it was about $10 billion through the government cost
That's
savings.
a hell of a difference.
That's a tenth, not even a tenth of what they said it was going to be spending. So this is just a farce. It's all a farce. It's all a joke. This is not about saving costs in government. This is about destroying government that is there to benefit the American people so that they can enrich themselves.
So what are they spending this money on? I mean, so is this one of those where they're robbing from this account to put money in another account? What do you see from your perch inside the Congress and the various committees that you serve on?
Well, we are asking that there be an investigation of where this money is actually going and what the contracts are. Many of us find it very curious that many of the agencies are one that either Elon Musk has litigation or disputes with,
of course,
or ones in which he has contracts that he believes he himself is going to be the one to save them, meaning he will put in more contracts for his own personal wealth.
It's interesting to me. The New York Times talks about the canceled humanities grants to help pay for Trump's Garden of Heroes. More than 85% of his existing grants, which support museums, historical sites, and scholarly and community projects across the country, have been cut.
Right.
What? For a Garden of Heroes?
Right. He's concerned about the Underground Railroad extolling Harriet Tubman.
Yes.
He's concerned about the African American Museum talking about the truth of this country, right? Which benefits all of us to have that knowledge. He's concerned about that and cutting those things, about the Kennedy Center and who's performing there, whether they liked him or didn't like him. But then he wants to take money and put it for individuals that he decides are the ones that we should be celebrating. Really? I don't trust his taste for him to make the decision about.
Well, since he's got to paint his face on everything, I'm just not, you know.
Why it's
color coordination.
It's Friday. It's Friday evening. We can go there a little bit.
Friday,
we can be a little petty.
And I haven't even had any adult beverage yet. Here's the deal. What are you guys doing? What's the Congress doing now? We were talking a little bit before about the lack of collegiality, the lack of sense that this institution still matters, that this institution on the Hill still has value in the proposition of this enterprise known as America.
Sure.
How do Democrats work? I mean, what levers can you push or pull to get the answers to a lot of the things that are happening, or more importantly, stop it?
Right.
Slow it down.
Well, we are attempting to slow it down.
Make it turn a corner.
Things like Cory Booker doing his filibuster slows it down. Having our own independent hearings that the Democrats are starting to have, because we don't have the power to call witnesses. We don't have the power to subpoena people or decide what a hearing is going to be on. But we sure enough can have discussions on our own, whether it's in our districts or in Republicans' districts, sharing with them what's happening. We have the bully pulpit, but Michael Steele, the party that you belong to and the party that I belong to. I worked for Republican Senate members of the House. I worked in the Bush administration. Those Republicans are shook.
Yeah.
Trump has them shook.
Yeah.
They're not willing to do the job that people have sent them there for, which is to ensure that this project called America, that our parents fought for, my dad fought in the Korean War for, is there for them and they're good. Yes, there are things that are wrong in our government. And as my dear friend Johanna Hayes said last night, we want to take out garbage out of government. Well, take out the trash. Don't burn down the house.
Managers at 2 federal agencies have warned staffers that DOGE might be secretly monitoring their communications, including using software to track computer activity and possibly using artificial intelligence to scan for disloyalty or DEI buzzwords. That's according to new reporting from Crooked Media and The Guardian. They spoke to more than 24 federal employees who shared emails from agency officials and screen grabs. One employee from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development put it like this, quote, "It's like being in a horror film where you know something out there wants to kill you, but you never know when or how or who it is." All right, joining us now, Crooked Media correspondent and anchor of What a Day newsletter, Matt Berg, and Crooked Media news editor, Greg Walter. Matt, I want to start with you. What is the big takeaway? When you guys did this, you talked to all these people. What is the thing that stood out, and what's the big picture of this investigation?
The big picture here is that anxiety and fear are running rampant among federal employees, in part because some of them have been told that DOGE is monitoring their workplace, whether that be with artificial intelligence or just snooping on
by whom?
Their managers at these at least 2 agencies that they are being monitored secretly in meetings.
Greg, what exactly are they monitoring for? Are they scanning for disloyalty? Are they scanning for, I don't know what?
Well, great question. DOGE has promised the American people both efficiency and transparency. It doesn't really seem to be delivering either one. But one of the things that the managers are warning employees about is they need to be careful with what they're talking about, because they shouldn't criticize Trump or Elon Musk or DOGE, and to be really cautious about what they're saying.
So in addition to writing their 5 things emails, which is the complaining I hear most from people in the government I'm talking to, they now have to worry about what they're saying even in their office. Greg, I also want to ask you, according to this new report, EPA managers told employees that DOGE was using AI to scan through agency communications to find any anti-Musk, anti-DOGE, as you just mentioned, or anti-Trump sentiments, adding that employees should be, quote, very careful about what they say in private messages and virtual meetings. All right, you've been around D.C. for a while. You've done a lot of reporting on the federal workforce. What impact do you think this is going to have in people's day-to-day effectiveness when they're afraid to even say something they think might be wrong with a program or whatever?
Well, I think this is reporting by Matt here and also Joseph Gideon from The Guardian. And what they found was that federal workers are scared. They're nervous. They're losing sleep. They're not able to focus on what they're doing. They're worried about employees who have been fired. They're worried about being fired themselves. And in addition, they are very concerned about surveillance. We've heard stories of some people who have gotten white noise machines to turn on in their office. We've heard stories about people going into an office break room to turn on the faucet. You know, kind
of like out of a spy movie, like get in the shower so we can have a conversation.
It's like old school Cold War stuff.
Right.
Except this is not the KGB. This is the Trump administration that they're worried about.
All right, Matt, I do need to say the White House has issued a blanket denial saying, in part, quote, none of this story is true, and another fake news reporter is once again missing the point of DOGE. The EPA also denied its recording meetings, and the VA, you said, didn't respond to comment. Do you have a response to their response?
The managers seem to think otherwise. They think that DOGE is, in fact, doing this spying. The State Department also denied that they are scanning for loyalty or other, quote, ridiculous purposes. But the State Department is also aware these people are turning on the sinks and are worried that hot mics might be around. So managers seem to think otherwise at least 2 agencies.
I mean, it's been clear to government employees for years in Washington that people could or might be listening to them. I mean, I used to work in the State Department booth, and people would say, like, just be careful what you say around. So what's different about this, Greg? Is this just a whole nother level?
What's new is that managers are warning employees to be careful about not just whether you're spilling state secrets or whether you are saying something that could be embarrassing if it got out. They're telling them, don't criticize Donald Trump. Be careful about criticizing Elon Musk. Be careful about criticizing DOGE. And this is happening in the context when a lot of people are losing their jobs. They're uncertain about their future. And what Matt and Joseph found is a real culture of managers telling federal workers to be careful and federal workers taking extraordinary steps to be careful about what they're saying in these official lines of communication.
And Matt, very quickly before I let you guys go. All right, so you've already got people stressing about losing their jobs. You've got people stressing about whether or not they write these 5 things emails. On top of that, they're stressed about what they say. Do people have the bandwidth to do their jobs? Is this going to impact like the actual efficacy of these agencies?
So what I'm hearing from about 24 people who are in these agencies is that this is a huge distraction for them. They're worried, they're nervous, they don't want to come to work. And in a lot of ways, that might be the point of this.
All right, Matt and Greg, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
After a lot of hype, Steve Ratner has made his way over to the Southwest walls with his charts. We've been teasing this for a while. We're glad he is there. So, Steve, take us through the charts. The first one, we know the president, yesterday he took to social media a couple of different times talking about this bill, talking about the tax cuts that are coming. But do they have a plan to pay for them?
So, Jonathan, in reference to a comment Joe made several teases ago, I just want to say when I was a young reporter, we had an expression called a DBI about certain stories, and DBI meant dull but important. So this is really important. I'm going to try not to make it dull, but bear with me for a second. So let's just go back to the two budget plans. The House back in February passed its budget plan, and it would have had up to $4.5 trillion of tax cuts. It would have had some spending increases for things like defense. It would have cut a lot of money out of Medicaid, $880 billion potentially out of that sector anyway, and it would have added $2.8 trillion to the deficit over the next 10 years. Then the Senate came along, and it passed its version about a week or so ago, and it had $5.3 trillion of tax cuts. It had spending increases for some of the same things, defense and so forth. It had $4 billion, that's $4 billion with a B, of spending reductions, $1 billion each in 4 categories, and it would have added $5.8 trillion to the deficit. What happened yesterday is the House adopted this. So we are now looking at potentially a $5.8 trillion increase in debt over the next 10 years. The Senate leader, John Thune, is talking about putting some spending cuts into the Senate version. That is all TBD. Right now, what we have is this $5.8 trillion.
Yeah, Steve, you're going to get to this a little bit later, but you and I have been talking about this now for well over a decade. We're at $36 trillion right now. We're already in a fiscal crisis. We can't add another $5 trillion to the debt. I just do sit here and just wonder how any conservative, economic conservative could have voted for this resolution, knowing they're going to add $5 trillion more to a $36 trillion debt. That again is actually pushing us toward a fiscal cliff.
Joe, it's truly unbelievable. So let's put that in perspective with some other bills that, in fact, Republicans said were wasteful and excessive and so forth. So you've got this $5.8 trillion that we talked about, 2.8 at the House. But let's look at some other things. The bipartisan infrastructure law, $400 billion. The American Rescue Plan, which was much criticized by Republicans, a COVID-era plan, $1.8 trillion. The CARES Act, 1.7, and even Trump's own first tax cut, 1.5 trillion. So they've put all this on steroids. And to your point, here's where we're headed. We are headed all the way up here. We're now roughly, our debt happens by coincidence to be essentially equal to the size of our economy, but it is going to continue to escalate. This is the Senate one up here, obviously ahead of the other ones. And remember one other important point, Joe, that in addition to this, we have all these liabilities for Social Security and Medicare. And right now, we would need to deposit, in effect, another $73 trillion into those trust funds to pay for those benefits. They're not fully funded. So we have a massive fiscal problem.
Well, Steve, we got a huge fiscal problem when you start talking about bond markets and what do we worry about bond markets, and you're starting to worry about possibly interest rates going up. That makes things worse. And just one note here, we are now spending more paying off interest on our debt. The federal government is on the credit card, the $36 trillion credit card, than we are paying on the defense of this country. So interest on the debt now is a bigger line item than actually our military.
And here you have it right here, Joe. Interest 881, defense 855, and everything less. There is an interesting thing called Ferguson's Law. It was developed by a Scottish political theorist in the 17th century, that when a country's debt service exceeds its defense, it's got problems. And there are examples like 17th century Spain and even Britain in the 1930s, which was still under a mountain of debt from World War I, trying to deal with Hitler. And so this is not a good place to be. But let's also look at what could have been. Here's what could have been. If back in 2001, we hadn't done some things, we literally could have paid off our debt. And what were those things? Huge tax cuts, originally starting under George W. Bush and then under Trump 1.0. We increased discretionary spending far more than inflation and economic growth would have suggested, although I will concede some of this was for defense. And then we had recession responses, initially to the financial crisis and then to COVID. Sure, we would have done some of this, but you could imagine that all of this could have been down here somewhere anyway, at a very prudent and manageable debt level. And instead, we're sitting up here and going over there.
Yeah, and Steve, you say debt is a choice. I remember when I first ran in 1994 and said we were going to balance the budget. People said we were crazy, said it couldn't happen. We made tough choices, and Bill Clinton made tough choices before we even got there. But Democrats and Republicans alike made tough choices over 6 years, and we balanced the budget. We balanced it 4 years in a row. And now this. Steve Rattner, thank you so much. I greatly appreciate it.